With Genshin now in its 5th year of service, the meta has advanced a significant amount, especially with version 5's units pushing the ceiling of power more than ever. A natural consequence of this is a drop in relevance for older characters, not just because they were superseded in performance or value, but also for the simple reason that we just have more characters in the pool that you have to split equity with. Some units fell off more visibly, while for others, it's not quite certain as to how they're doing. One of Genshin's most consistently popular characters, both in-game and outside of it, is Raiden Shogun, the Electro Archon, representative of an element who went through a roller coaster of events ever since the game's inception. One of the first Why Everyone Plays videos I made was on Shogun, and she was arguably one of the most waifued characters as well, at least until we got more waifu material characters. It's crazy to think she came out back in September of 2021, 3.5 years ago. Suffice to say, she has a lot of history to her, and though Archons were designed to be known for a specific thing, surprisingly, Shogun's had an extremely varied history during her tenure, showing respectable meta resilience despite being one of the more senior Archons in the roster. But with the game advancing so quickly, how does she hold up in the current landscape? We're going to be looking into that for today. What happened to Raiden Shogun, where is she now, and how do things look for her in the coming years? From the day she came out, Shogun was immediately misunderstood, whether it was due to players recalling the failure that was Zhongli's awful release, or being influenced by the sentiment that Electro was the worst element in the game throughout most of version 1. People were doom posting the heck out of her when she came out, believing she had the same issue of being as awful as the element she epitomized. It's hard to argue against that though. Electro had a pretty lackluster start. Despite having two respectable characters from the get-go, Official and Beidou, there just wasn't a big incentive to run that element when Pyro, the other offense-oriented element, was the clear better choice. Not getting an Electro 5-star all throughout version 1 besides coaching only made it more difficult to convince players otherwise, which is partly what made Shogun's inclusion not only anticipated, but also necessitated. If there was any element that needed a boost, it was Electro, and what a boost it was. After the knee-jerk doom posting they made about her, players began to test out Shogun's capabilities, only to find out she wasn't half bad. Within a few weeks, many people took notice of a specific team composition that ended up performing extremely well. The Raiden National Team, a variant of the original national team consisting of 4 members of the original Power 5. Sucrose, Xiangling, Xingqiu, and Bennett. Only the Raiden National Team would see Shogun taking the place of Sucrose for more concentrated DPS. The incentives were self-apparent. With the national team being heavily focused on each character contributing equally in party DPS, Shogun's ability to boost the elemental burst damage of her entire party based on their energy cost allowed Xingqiu and Xiangling to gain a sizable increase in their own damage, and with the 3 4-stars all being burst-oriented units, this synergy would work both ways, as their ultimate would then help to build up Shogun's own ultimate to deal bonus damage. During this time, Xiangling would of course be able to snapshot Bennett's fantastic voyage, while eventually switching to Shogun for active use of the buff. From then on, Shogun would activate her elemental burst and capitalize on the damage increase from her teammates' abilities, dealing an insane amount of front-loaded DPS, especially for the time she came out. Thanks to her Musuishin state charging her team's burst, by the time Shogun's uptime was exhausted, her teammates would have their bursts back up, resulting in a feedback loop where she would help her team do more damage and use their bursts more often, which would then in turn help Shogun's own burst do more damage. They would keep building off each other like that. Raiden National was the first high-profile instance of her proper team composition in Genshin. Throughout most of version 1, we simply just did not have enough units to establish the required infrastructure to make proper teams on a wider scale. What enabled this one to stand out in particular is that it required only 1 5-star unit, the Electro Archon, as opposed to other slapdash teams at the time needing 2 or sometimes 3. Secondly, it was the first popularized team to cover most if not all situations in Spiral Abyss. The original national team had good AoE coverage thanks to Sucrose and Xiangling blasting everything around them, but it wasn't a very comfortable team to play. Raiden National, on the other hand, carried a lot more single-target DPS, and Shogun could brute force her way through most bosses and whatnot that came around. Though her AoE was comparatively worse than Sucrose, she could increase Xiangling's Pyronator DPS to take care of any ads nearby. The healing from Bennett and damage mitigation from Xingqiu made Shogun able to face tank most if not all things in the game at the time as well. Thirdly, it was easy to play. Child International, I believe, had better performance overall depending on how built your team was, but the mechanical requirements made it more challenging to play optimally and thus not a popular team. Raiden National was super easy to play and very straightforward. It was far and away the most accessible meta team at the time, which helped to establish her as a clear must-have for endgame all throughout version 2. Looking at the graphics on screen, you could see that she consistently hovered above 50% usage, breaking above 70 or even 80 on more occasions than one. Calling her the most dominant DPS character in the game throughout late 2021 and all of 2022 was the understatement of the year. Even as we enter version 3, she was still the most dominant main DPS in the game courtesy of her extreme ease of use and high performance. Bear in mind, this was all before Dendro buffed Electro. Technically, she also had a hypercarry team through usage of Kujo Sada, but despite having decent performance, it was a niche option that few players got into. When Dendro came out in version 3, there were many questions on how that would affect the standing of Raiden National, a team that used no Dendro characters whatsoever and couldn't really find a reason to with the initial units we got. One more thing is that the key factor for Raiden National's success in version 2 was that there really wasn't much competition. Your choices were Ayaka Freeze, Ito Managio, Double Hydro Hutal, which only became a thing at the very tail end of version 2, maybe Ayato Soup, and that's about it. Your selection for endgame ready teams was few and far between, and Raiden National was still by far the cheapest and most accessible of all of them. Could the same thing be said now that we have more teams though? Only time would tell. Fortunately, the Raiden National team by this point garnered a reputation for being a comfort pick. It may no longer have been the most optimal or strongest team at the time, but it still maintained a firm grasp on market share thanks to players having made good use of it all throughout the version prior, so they saw no reason to stop doing so until the game forced their hand. The same reason Zhongli is still one of the most popular units in the game to this day. They're just comfortable. Shogun wouldn't have to depend on her legacy alone though. With the amount of buffs given to Electro in the form of new reactions, she surprisingly found a side hustle by driving Hyper Bloom teams with her skill. Prior to Nahida, Shogun was the only character in the game with the skill duration exceeding its cooldown, allowing for consistent uptime and the perfect application interval for such a team. Funnily enough, however, in these teams you made zero use of her burst at all. She purely existed for the elemental skill and not much more. I mean, if you wanted to, you could use her ultimate for the quick blast of damage and then swap out, but the main focus was her skill. Still though, it was all she needed. She could pair nicely with two of the game's new shiny toys, Nahida and Alhaitham. Her side hustle is what allowed her to still more or less hold a very cozy 50% plus usage rate in Spiral Abyss all throughout version 3 as well. Anytime Raiden National and or Hyper Carry was remotely useful in either chamber, she would be used, and if not, you could always play her for Hyper Bloom support with the Dendro team. Electro was enjoying an auspicious year, and Shogun was able to grab a piece of that, although strangely, it was around this time discussion began to circulate over whether she was truly the best Electro character when other Electro units got buffed by Dendro more than she did. Nevertheless, Shogun was chilling. She was so strong for the time she came out that even as the power floor of the game got elevated, her ceiling was enough to keep her competitive even with the advent of Tignati, Nilu, Wander, Shalna boosted by Farazan, and Alhaitham. Much of version 3 was spent working on the Dendro roster, and Electro and Hydro were the main beneficiaries of it. Version 4 is where things started to get a bit tricky. Not only were there more measurable instances of power creep, but there was also a big shift in character focus. The better part of version 2 and 3 was aimed at expanding on elemental reactions now that we finally had multiple characters for each element that could be used at a high level, and so the idea for version 4 was to expand more on personal DPS and niche aspects. While this was underway, Shogun was still chilling above 50% since it wasn't until around 4.2 where things really took off. Novelette would be the first character to overthrow her position as the #1 attacker in the game since her advent. Alhaitham came close a number of times, but Shogun, albeit supplemented by a Dendro sidekick, was still the reigning champ. No longer the case now. Novelette's superior personal damage and equally accessible team options made him by far the best general DPS in the game, having even more AoE and damage uptime than her. Miraculously, Novelette didn't make use of any national members whatsoever, allowing for players to use him on one side and still go Raiden National, Hyper Carry, or Hyper Bloom on the other. Be that as it may, it did mark a significant turning point for Shogun's career as she went from being a guaranteed selection for one role into an optional selection. Prior to the Hydro Sovereign, it was almost assured for one side of Spiral Abyss to feature Raiden Shogun, and then the onus would be on the player to figure out who they wanted to use for the other side, whether Hutal Double Hydro, Alhaitham Spread, Child International, Ayaka Freeze, what have you. Now everything got moved one space to the side, where Novelette would be the guaranteed pick for one side, with Raiden Shogun being an option for the other. Again, being the turn your brain off and go Unga Bunga team, people still abuse the heck out of Raiden Shogun. Her national team still had no trouble clearing whatever stood in your way, and at any point it couldn't, there was a non-zero chance you could use her in a Hyper Bloom team and make it work regardless. She was holding on very nicely. All the other DPS units that came out during this time, while strong, were ultimately non-essential. Linny was good, but you could skip him. Risley was good, but you could skip him. Navia was good, but you could skip her. With it being just Novelette, Shogun still had a very strong reason to be used for the other side. Not that she was the best option, there was still Alhaitham, Hutal, Child and such, but the point is, she was competitive, especially for budget players. Still though, it was impactful enough to send her from 60 to 70% usage to about 40 to 50. I should also add that it didn't help that she didn't really have any competition in her own department. Most Electro characters were sub-DPS units like Fischl, Yaemiko, and Shinobu, while the only new main DPS option we got at the time was one of the biggest disappointments to ever come out in relation to how overpowered we thought he would be. 4.6s where holding market share got noticeably tougher for the Electro Archon. First, Arlecchino, being the definitive strongest attacker in the game when she came out. Arlecchino, who like Neuvillette and Shogun also cleared the game with any team you could think of, stood head and shoulders above most if not every existing option for the second party slot at the time. Her DPS was just so high that unless that Cycle of Abyss was specifically geared to circumstantially fuck her over, she was by far the best default option, making the two go-to teams for quick and easy clears Neuvillette and Arlecchino. And with the Harbinger wanting the same teammates that Shogun used, there was more meaningful opportunity cost in that regard. Shogun could still rely on her secondary role in Dendro teams, although at this point it was starting to become her main role. Basically, enough broken DPS characters came out to where Shogun was far from being the only one anymore. We're now in late version 4, over 2.5 years since the Electro Archon's debut. Not only was the Raiden national team getting noticeably power crept, but units came out that began to vie for the same teammates. Linny wanted them, Navia wanted them, and now Arlecchino wanted them. While this next release wasn't as impactful on Shogun's presence, it did cover an aspect of her that wasn't touched practically since the day she came out, another strong Electro attacker, Clorette. The two didn't really overlap all that much. Clorette is all about aggravate and quick bloom main DPS, maybe a bit of overloaded on the side, while Shogun's hyper bloom sub DPS and more of an all-purpose unit. But the point is, there was an alternative option for Electro Dendro, or even just conventional Electro damage. For my money, they're roughly around the same in power, and despite not having the same exact roles, they're in a similar niche. Around this time, Shogun's popularity began to take a dive. Every single niche you found her in, you also found someone else. Whether or not they were stronger than her at that niche, there was someone who contested her for market share, resulting in the first instance of her dropping below 40% and into the 30 range. In defense of Shogun though, that's nothing short of impressive. Most main DPS units from back in version 1 and 2 by this point have fallen into single digits, while Shogun was still holding on very strong despite her age. Unfortunately, it would get much harder for her going forward. Version 5 pushed the sentiments of version 4 even further by encouraging, if not outright obligating you to pair Nanlan units together, which if done so resulted in power and performance far beyond what was capable before. To begin with, version 5 had arguably the most aggressive release category. In the span of 3 versions, we got 4 5-star main DPS characters, each one stronger tthan the last. Milani, Kanish, Chaska, Mavuiga. None that were Electro mind you, but the number of units who could outclass Shogun in DPS went from maybe 1 or 2 to now upwards of half a dozen. And around this time, Spiral Abyss became noticeably more party stringent, forcing it to take specific characters that, unsubtly pressured by the game, could handle that specific situation. The only Dendro characters we got between the start of version 4 to now were 2 units, neither of whom saw any usage in Bloom or even Quicken teams, so while the Dendro category was being updated with some very welcome additions, Electro did not accompany them in the rise up. On one hand, Shogun was being hit by characters with more personal damage and uptime than her with equal accessibility and ease of use to match. And on the other hand, Dendro interactions with Electro haven't really been updated since version 3. The only major update to Electro directly has been Chevreuse and Overload teams, which you can play with Shogun, but ultimately it ends up being another personal DPS team, and the Electro Archon's age is really starting to show. In the current state of Genshin, Raiden National is no longer as effective as it used to be, and Electro-related Dendro stuff hasn't been updated in quite some time. Electro in and of itself, despite being considered a DPS element, was never really known for doing lots of personal damage anyway. Most of its best characters right now are supports or sub-DPS units. Considering we're in an era of personal damage, as evident by the characters we got over the past year and likely will continue to receive, while I don't think Shogun's become obscure, it's a clear downward trajectory for her going forward. I believe she now hangs around the 10 to 20% usage mark. I mean, hey, you have to admit, for someone who was initially conceived to be a main attacker, the fact that she's still holding strong even after all that version 4 and 5 brought is worth giving praise for. I don't think she's the best Electro character anymore. That would either go to Aurora and Fischl or maybe Yansan when she comes out, just hedging my bets, and I don't think she's someone you need to go out of your way to pull for anymore. But for those who already have her, I don't see a reason for you to completely drop her either though. Yet. She had a very good run. What do you guys think about Raiden Shogun? Do you believe she still has it in her to keep going, or is this as far as she goes? Let me know in the comments down below. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you'd like to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFarum, join my Discord server, and check out my other What Happened To episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.